Okay, so continuing on, and I'm sure you can see that I'm no longer visible. That's because I figured you didn't really need to see me to be able to follow along with the PowerPoint, and I was finding that the thumbnail was blocking some of the text. So sorry about that. You can hear my voice. So what do I mean when I say to engage with what you've read? Well, basically it just means to make sure that you're not just plunking down information from your sources and then just moving on. You're going to want to make sure that your paper is about more than just facts. It's about more than simply explaining a statistic or plunking down a quote, but you also want to comment on that information. You want to react to it. You want to develop it, and by develop it, I mean show us how it relates to the overall point that you're making. And I see this a lot where someone will put a lot of interesting information in a paragraph, but we don't really know why we're being told this. And it can be very confusing. You know, you're thinking, well, how does this relate to what we're talking about here? So you're going to want to think and write about the implications of what you learned from your sources. So what does all of this mean? You know, in the course of a paper, it's going to mean, what does this mean in the context of the point that I'm making? So, you know, every paragraph, for example, needs a topic sentence. A paragraph should begin with a topic sentence that explains the take-home message, the main idea that you want to express with that paragraph. So if you are including a statistic, a quote, a piece of information about something that was done in a study or something like that, it should be clear to the reader why you're including that and what it has to do with that topic sentence, with that main point. On a larger scale, when you're planning a paper and you're thinking about what you want to write on, when you're thinking about a thesis statement or a point for the whole paper, you're going to want to think about, what do all these things mean for practice, for further research, sometimes even for policy or legislation, etc. It depends on what you're writing about, but you're really digging in and you're thinking about the so what question. What does all this mean and why is it important? So I mentioned the so what question. Why is this important? What can we learn from this? Why do we need to learn it? What more do we need to know? So when you come across interesting studies or you come across interesting facts in articles that you're reading, those are the questions you should be thinking about. So it's not enough simply to present the information. We have to then think critically about that information, and we have to combine it with the point that we're trying to make. We also have to compare and contrast the source material. So, you know, if you're bringing up something from one study and something that a set of researchers found, well, how does that jive with other studies, with other authors' perspectives, with your own experience, with discussions you've had in class or with colleagues? So be thinking about all of that stuff. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to talk about every single one of those things anytime you bring up a statistic or a fact from a study. Of course not. But it just means that there may be something in there that is relevant and that will help you to develop your point for your reader. And again, always going back to that so what question. We're going back to, how do we develop the take-home message, the bottom line message that we want our reader to take away. So think of it like a puzzle. If I were going to invite you over and show you a jigsaw puzzle that I had, I would not do that by showing you each individual piece one by one. I wouldn't say, you know, here's a green blob and here's a blue blob. That would be tremendously boring. What I would do instead is I would wait until I'd put the whole puzzle together, and then I would show you the picture. So you've got your Eiffel Tower or your basket of kittens or whatever. And every quote, every statistic, every paraphrase, every idea, every piece of information from research that you've read about that you put into your paper is one little piece of the puzzle. And it's important for you, your job as the writer, is to put those pieces together in a way that makes sense for the reader and to show the final picture. So you're going to need to show readers how your source material relates to the purpose of your paper, how it helps you make your point. Now, the example on the next two slides is not mine. It's from the Walden University Writing Center's online tutorial on literature reviews, which I can't recommend enough. And I would say that for this Walden University Writing Center website as a whole. It is tremendous. It has all kinds of wonderful guides to writing all sorts of different papers, great advice on how to use sources, so I would highly recommend it. And in particular, there is a guide on there called Using Evidence, and if you just go and Google Walden University Writing Center Using Evidence, this will pop right up. It has a little 3-part tutorial called Introduce, Integrate, Explain, and if people would simply use that advice, their papers would improve 100-fold. Introduce, Integrate, Explain. And it kind of deals with everything that I've just been talking about, but it also gives examples that we just don't have time to do in a 1-hour video. But here's an example. This is a common error, and they've referred to it as citation salad, which I think is hilarious and very accurate. So citation salad happens when a writer presents a lot of good and interesting information in a paragraph, but they don't really connect the dots for the reader in terms of how it all fits together and what the overall point is. So let's look at this paragraph, which is an example of citation salad, and then we'll look at how to fix it. Author X argued that the cost of public transportation in the Midwest affected student participation in after-school activities. Author Y reported that 60% of high school students in the United States relied on school buses to get home. According to author Z, in a study of after-school program attendance, most of the participants received rides home from parents or friends. Okay, so we basically get an idea that we're talking here about, public transportation or transportation in general and after-school programs. But notice there's no topic sentence in here. We just get right to source material. And there's just kind of a bunch of different studies that they've drawn from, but we don't have an overall point. There's no topic sentence. We don't know what the so what question is here. So how would we fix this? Now I've underlined the new parts that they've added to fix this paragraph. Multiple studies indicated a strong link between transportation availability and student engagement in extracurricular activities. Now there we go. Now we have a topic sentence, that there's a link between transportation availability and whether students can be involved in extracurricular stuff at school. Author X argued that the cost of public transportation in the Midwest affected student participation in after-school activities, which was similar to findings in studies across the country. Author Y reported that 60% of high school students in the United States relied on school buses to get home, meaning that the majority of students had no alternative means of getting home if they decided to stay after regular school hours. According to author Z, in a study of after-school program attendance, most of the participants received rides home from parents or friends. In addition to transportation availability, researchers have noted a strong correlation between student participation in extracurricular activities and parental involvement. That last sentence, by the way, is what we would refer to as a transition sentence, and that's indicating that the next paragraph is going to be about this connection between parental involvement and student participation in extracurricular activities. So that's how you fix that. Basically, those underlined those underlined sentences and phrases are kind of like connective tissue. That's what's there to connect all of these different pieces of source material and to find a main point that emerges from that. We have a topic sentence now, and we have commentary on this source material. Much easier to understand. We understand what the writer is trying to say. We understand why this source material is being presented. Much, much better. So another thing to consider is the use of direct quotations. Now, you want to use direct quotes extremely sparingly in academic writing. You don't want a lot of quotes. So you want to rely mostly on paraphrasing and summarizing instead. And this is because quotes, number one, interrupt the flow of a paper. They interrupt your narrative voice. They can make your paper feel choppy. They can also give the impression that you're relying too much on other people's ideas, and that's not the impression you want. So paraphrase and summary are better. I would say a good rule of thumb is no more than one quotation per page, and I would even argue that that's probably a little too much. It's okay to use a quote occasionally. It's okay to use quotes, for example, if the author's wording is just especially elegant or persuasive. You can't imagine you could say it as well. If you try to paraphrase it and you can't quite do it, sometimes some sentences are more difficult to paraphrase than others. Sometimes quotes are good if you need to define a term, or if you need a description of something. So those are a few examples of times when it's okay to use a quote, and it's really okay anytime as long as you don't use them too often. Now the example on the next two slides again is from Walden University Writing Center. So here's a common error. Plop quotes. I used to call them airdropped quotes, but I like the Walden University's word plop quotes. This is when you just kind of plunk down a quote without any preamble, no introduction, and then no response either. So it's just kind of plunked. Many educators and community members have expressed frustration about the lack of financial support for arts education. The arts and its related businesses are responsible for billions of dollars in cultural exports for this country. Okay, so first of all, I have a couple of problems with this paragraph. Number one, it's a two-sentence paragraph, which is a bad idea, because a paragraph should start with a topic sentence, and then it should completely develop that topic sentence. You can't develop a main idea in one sentence. So that's impossible. So avoid it for that reason. But also, all we have here is this idea that people have expressed frustration, and then we just have a quote kind of out of nowhere, and we don't have any connection whatsoever with that sentence, if it's intended to be a topic sentence or what. It's plunked. So how would we fix it? Well, we fix it by, as I said a moment ago, introducing, integrating, and explaining our source material. And by the way, that's true whether you're quoting or you're paraphrasing. You always want to introduce, integrate, and explain. And this is how you do that. Many educators and community members have expressed frustration about the lack of financial support for arts education. In a prepared statement at a congressional hearing on arts funding, Seegers stated that the arts and its related businesses are responsible for billions of dollars in the cultural exports for this country. So it would be in the government's best interest to strengthen arts education rather than allowing this funding to continue to diminish. And I would hope that that paragraph would continue. I think here they're just trying to show how not to plunk down a quote. But you see what they're doing here. And you could introduce a quote just as easily as saying according to Seegers, too, if you don't want to have to get into the rigmarole about a prepared statement or whatever. Just simply according to Seegers would be fine, but you need to do something. You can't just start a quote. And then what we have after is some commentary on the quote, which is great. So sort of getting at that so what question, why that quote, what that quote is in fact saying, and what it has to do with the overall point. Remember that whether you're quoting directly, whether you're summarizing, or whether you're paraphrasing, you must always cite your sources. So even if you're not using someone's direct words, you still have to cite your source. Give credit whether you're using someone's exact words or whether you're using their ideas. If it did not originate in your noodle, you gotta cite it. So proper paraphrasing is absolutely crucial in order to avoid unintentional plagiarism and to incorporate your sources smoothly and accurately. And people make a lot of mistakes while paraphrasing. So it's really important to learn how to do that. And I have a nice little, I think, foolproof paraphrasing technique that I recommend people use. So step one, and this may seem obvious, but in my experience, a lot of people end up sticking too closely to the original source wording when trying to paraphrase, simply because they're trying to paraphrase a sentence that they don't completely understand. They might be rushing to meet a deadline and they find a quote that kind of sounds good, but they haven't really fully absorbed the meaning. And so they end up just kind of copying and just changing a couple of words around. And that's not really what paraphrasing is. So the first step is to make sure that you fully understand the passage that you plan to paraphrase. So that means reading it carefully as many times as necessary, so that you're absolutely sure you understand it. And I would kind of talk through it a little bit, what is this author trying to say? Make sure I completely understand it. And it's also important, I think, to change the way that you think about paraphrasing. Don't think of it as changing words around in a sentence. Think of it as, if you read something interesting on a website and you wanted to go tell your significant other about it, you wouldn't have the website in front of you and just change a couple of words around as you explain it to your friend. You would say, oh, I just read the funniest thing, and you would just tell them, right? That's what paraphrasing is. That's really all it is. You've read something interesting and you're just going to tell your readers about it in your own words, being the operative term. So once you're sure that you completely understand the passage that you plan to paraphrase, put it away. Don't look at it while you're trying to paraphrase it, because if you're looking at it, you're going to be too tempted to just change a few little words around, and that way lies accidental plagiarism. You're going to stick too closely to that original source wording. So I can see I'm coming up on another 15 minutes ending. So we're going to stop part 2, and I will be with you in just a moment for part 3. And we'll pick up right where we left off.